Well, ladies and gentlemen, after all kinds of alarms and excursions, we try again. I was asked to contribute a general talk on language learner autonomy to this event. And so I decided what I should do was really just three things. First of all, explain to you what that term, language learner autonomy, means to me here and now today. Why I think my understanding of language learner autonomy is something that deserves to be taken seriously by teachers, and how we can go about operationalizing, implementing this view of language learner autonomy in our classes. And then in the conclusion, I'll very briefly make some suggestions regarding online learning. So the next slide, please. What is language learner autonomy? And we can move straight on. Let me begin with giving you this working definition. For me, language learner autonomy is a teaching learning dynamic in which learners plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. But beyond that, from the beginning, they do this, plan, implement, monitor, evaluate, as far as possible in the target language, which becomes then a channel of their individual and collaborative agents. By exercising agency in the target language, they gradually develop proficiency, but it's a proficiency that's reflective as well as communicative. And they also develop their autonomy as learners and users of their target language, which then becomes a fully integrated part of their plurilingual repertoire and identity. Let me now share with you learning outcomes, very brief examples, from three different learning environments. So the next slide. My first example is a text produced by a 15-year-old Danish learner in one of Leni Dam's classes more than 20 years ago. The learner wrote the text in answer to the question, after 4 years of English, how would you assess your overall progress? And I've transcribed the text she produced without any kind of correction or adjustment. I already make use of the fixed procedures from our diaries when trying to get something done at home. Then I make a list of what to do or remember the following day. That makes things much easier. I've also, via English, learned to start a conversation with a stranger and ask good questions. And I think that our together session has helped me to become better at listening to other people and to be interested in them. I feel that I've learned to believe in myself and to be independent. Now, as a language learning outcome, this text is perfection. If it were presented as a text written by a 15-year-old native speaker, certainly here in Ireland, one would accept it as such, and it would be further accepted as evidence of a very satisfactory development in terms of the capacity to think coherently and to express that clearly, though simply, in writing. But it's more than that, isn't it? Because what this girl is doing is telling us how the way in which she's learned English has actually had an impact on the way she lives her life outside the classroom. And it's also had an impact on her and her awareness of herself as a member of the class. I already make use of the fixed procedures at the beginning of the text, and I feel I've learned to believe in myself and to be independent at the beginning. Clearly, English is already a fully integrated part of this learner's identity, of her plurilingual repertoire. Next slide. The second example is by a very different kind of learner, a woman who was admitted to Ireland as an adult refugee. Now, she attended an intensive English language course for which I was responsible. It was 20 hours a week, 4 hours a day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, plus quite a lot of out-of-class learning requirements. When she started with us, as her text explains, her English was a bit sketchy and shaky. This little text, which is part of a larger self-assessment that she wrote at the end of a year of being with us, shows how far she's come. She writes, "I want to learn to help my children and also for my future. I always missed medical appointment because I couldn't understand the receptionist when he was speaking to me. But now my English is very good. And my experience now is speaking good English with people and say many things in English. My experience now is to help my children do their homework. And I can write English in letters. Now, when I send my girls to school, I can speak to their teacher. And when I go to the GP, the doctor, I can speak and understand very well." Again, although her text isn't absolutely perfect, although it's easy to identify features of it that are non-native, it's nevertheless very fluent and very coherent. And again, the language is a part of this learner's plurilingual repertoire and her identity. Next slide. My third example, or examples, come from Czech university students taking a course in English for sociology. Now, in this course, their teacher, Michaela Klirova, used a portfolio that she herself had designed in order to support this learning dynamic in which she expected her learners to plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. And the feedback that she's got here comes after the second semester. One student writes, "It was easier than in the first semester. I knew what to do, where to find things. I could work on what worked best for me. For example, I knew where to find great sociological videos that helped with my listening the most." It's a very short sample of text, but it's very fluent. It's very confident. And it shows that the student is perfectly capable of steering his own learning about sociology through English, using this portfolio approach. Feedback from the second learner is more narrowly focused. It's a great opportunity, portfolio learning, to be creative while doing a homework. Due to that, it was my favorite one, and I especially enjoyed creating mind map on Coggle. Again, though, fluency and confidence and the capacity for autonomous work. The third example here is not a written feedback. One of the students at the end of the second semester made an appointment to come and talk to his teacher. And what he said to her was, "I came to thank you, not for what you've taught me, because now I know that what I've learned for myself, but for showing me the way." And that, in a couple of sentences, is what this learning dynamic that I label language learner autonomy is all about. Next slide. Language learner autonomy depends on three pedagogical principles that are interdependent and need to be operationalized or implemented in interaction with one another. There's the principle of learner control, where learners accept responsibility for their learning and are jointly responsible for planning the learning process and individual learning activities. There's the principle of learner reflection, which is already implicated by learner control, because you can't adequately control something if you're not thinking about it. but learner reflection goes some way beyond this to embrace peer and self-assessment. And those two principles, learner control and learner reflection, are embraced by the third principle, target language use. Because target language use isn't something that you add to learner control and learner reflection. It's the medium through which these things are done. Next slide. And the dynamic that I've been talking about in this first part of the talk is captured, I think, in this simple graphic. The large dark blue disk represents the interactive dialogic target language use that it's the teacher's job to initiate and support, scaffold, stimulate, and so on. And within that dialogic learning conversation, we have the exercise of learner control and learner reflection interacting with one another, and learners gradually learning larger degrees of control and more sophisticated reflection as their proficiency in the target language increases. Next slide, please. So why should teachers adopt these three principles of language learner autonomy? Why should they attempt to create this dialogic learning conversation as I've described it? Next slide. Well, let me offer you some theoretical arguments. Let me first focus on target language use, which I think can be boiled down to these two bullet points on the left. The teacher's primary task is to initiate and sustain a dialogic learning conversation. But in doing that, it's important to remember that writing is no less important than speaking. Now, current theories of second language acquisition assign a central role to unconscious implicit learning that arises from target language use. You won't become fluent in a language unless you are using it and attempting to use it all the time. At the same time, of course, if you're a language learner, you've got to undertake conscious, explicit learning activities in order to drive your language use forward, in order to give you an excuse for using the language in the first place. I've already several times insisted that the learning conversation should be dialogic. And that's not accidental, because in dialogue, all participants are expected to take discourse initiatives. And taking initiatives is the very beginning of learner autonomy. When the teacher in a learning dialogue speaks to the class at length to give an explanation or to describe a possible new learning activity or whatever, she's not shifting from dialogue to monologue, but taking a long turn in the dialogic learning conversation. One of the leading theoreticians of dialogic pedagogy in England is Robin Alexander. And just a few weeks ago, he published a new book entitled A Dialogic Teaching Companion. And in that book, he argues that dialogic teaching is guided by 6 principles. Dialogic teaching should be collective. That's to say, it should involve everybody in the learning environment. It should be supportive. That's to say that individuals who find it more difficult to participate in the dialogue should be helped. And they should never be excluded. Criticism should never be leveled at them. Dialogic teaching and learning should be reciprocal. That's to say that people listen to one another. We want learners to listen to us as teachers. As teachers, we must also listen to our learners, and we must expect them to listen to one another. Dialogic teaching should be deliberative, analytical, constantly questioning. It should be cumulative, building on language, building on knowledge, and it should be purposeful. It should always have a goal. Classroom talk should never be idle chatter. Writing is no less important than speaking. The ability to produce fluent and coherent written text is an essential feature of worthwhile second language proficiency. Think back to the example I showed you a few minutes ago of the adult refugee. Think how much her capacity to act as an autonomous agent in an English-speaking environment is enhanced by the high level of literate proficiency she's developed. But we must also remember that in the process of learning, writing also plays an essential role. First of all, because it supports speaking. If we make written notes as we speak with one another, if we note down things that other people say, we will be able to have a much more focused interaction than if we just depend on what happens between our ears and our mouths. Writing also plays an essential role in learning because it encourages a focus on form. The Canadian literacy scholar David Olson, 30 years ago now, published an article, a book chapter, entitled Writing is Metalinguistics. Next screen, please. Learner control is, of course, the essence of learner autonomy. Learner control was the starting point for Henri Olek's foundational exploration of autonomy in language learning, first published by the Council of Europe in 1979 and cited here in the commercially published 1981 edition. Right at the beginning of his text, Olek talks about taking control of one's learning as meaning determining the objectives, defining contents and progressions, selecting methods and techniques, monitoring progress, evaluating outcomes. Now, when learners use the target language to take control of their learning, they commit themselves to spontaneous, authentic target language use. And conscious, explicit learning is framed by that spontaneous, authentic target language use. So they exercise agency, they make choices, they take decisions, they follow through on those decisions in pursuit of curriculum goals. And the fact that they do that through the target language, to begin with, of course, very simply, but with increasing complexity, is what drives their implicit, unconscious learning of the language, while at the same time they're learning all kinds of things explicitly as they pursue these curriculum goals. It's worth noting that according to self-determination theory, humans have three interdependent psychological needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. We want to feel autonomous, that we're in charge of our own agenda. But we also need to feel that we're competent, that in pursuing our agenda, we actually achieve our goals. And we need to do those things in relation to other people as part of a social interactive community. The interdependence of these three needs explains why in any successful autonomy-focused language classroom, you have happy and motivated learners. Of course, you can't expect learners suddenly to be able to manage their own learning. Skills of self-management have to be learnt, and this is a central part of the teacher's task. It begins by her showing them how to document their learning in logbooks, portfolios. Logbooks, simple, plain exercise books that she has them structure in a way that makes them useful as a cumulative record of learning. Note that in encouraging learners' self-management and giving them control, it's important never to ask them to take decisions that they're not able to take, or to leave them without support. In the early stages, small steps. Next slide, please. Learner reflection. Learner reflection, as I've already said, is essential for effective self-management. And it should be a dominant feature of the learning conversation. And at the center of effective reflection is self and peer assessment. Now, a learning conversation that's truly dialogic is also necessarily reflective. Think particularly of three of Robin Alexander's principles: reciprocal, deliberative, purposeful. Continuous documentation of the learning process, and that means from the beginning to the end of every class, and also outside class, provides learners with an essential focus for reflection, but it also supports the internal dialogue that consolidates learning. A learning conversation that's truly dialogic is reflective, and reflection implies and should lead into self and peer assessment. And this is something that Lene Dam-Legenhausen and I discuss at some length in our 2017 book. It's important that learners are involved in determining the criteria for self and peer assessment. Our own teacher assessment should be governed by the same criteria as learners' self and peer assessment. And self and peer assessment and teacher assessment should take account of the criteria applied in external tests and exams. Next slide, please. So I've tried to explain what I think language learner autonomy is, a particular kind of teaching learning dynamic. And I've given you some examples of the kind of learning outcomes that it can produce. And I've given you a very brief taste of some of the theoretical arguments and their practical consequences that underpin this concept of teaching and learning language. Let me now expand further on that by saying a bit about making language learner autonomy a reality. Next slide, please. And in this, some of the slides are going to talk about learners in different categories. I've chosen the three that I'm most closely familiar with: lower secondary, adult migrants, and university students. They're really all doing the same kind of thing, but those things need to vary according to these different environments. And in some cases, all learners should be behaving in exactly the same way. So I start with curriculum. Almost always we have to teach according to a curriculum, and we can't expect our learners to take control of their learning and manage it unless we begin by making sure they understand what they're expected to achieve. At lower secondary level, it's important to discuss the goals with them for each school year at the beginning of the year, if necessary, simplifying those goals. And make sure that the learners have those goals written in their target language. They might, for example, have them on a printed sheet that they staple into the back of their logbook, so that they can refer to them regularly, and make sure that they do refer to them regularly. In the case of adult migrants, if you have to work with a traditional curriculum, translate it into an inventory of your learners' everyday needs and aspirations. If you don't, and we didn't have to in our work with adult migrants in Dublin, then you can devise your own curriculum by negotiating with the learners on the basis of their needs. And the curriculum can evolve over time as learners gradually become more proficient, but also fulfill the needs they've identified. With regard to language for academic purposes, I think the purpose of that kind of language learning is to enable students to become members of their academic discipline in their target language. And that means that their language learning goals have to be aligned with their larger academic curriculum goals. Next slide, please. The target language as medium of teaching and learning. From the beginning, it's important to set clear rules for classroom communication. It's important not to try to suppress learners' first languages. And it's important always to emphasize the importance of writing. Each learner's first language is the medium of her or his consciousness and discursive thinking. And it's thus central to her or his sense of self and identity. Now, the goal of language learner autonomy is to add the target language to the learner's first language in a fully integrated way. Don't be afraid of exploring similarities and differences between the target language and the dominant language of instruction. If you have multiple first languages in your class, if you've got a lot of migrants in your class, for example, then draw those languages into the discussion. But ensure that the discussion is conducted predominantly in the target language with as much scaffolding as you need to provide. Try to develop a two-way relation between writing and speaking, using written notes to support speaking and speaking to generate written text. And remember that writing segments speech, and that aids comprehension, but it also encourages and supports the implicit learning of grammar. Next slide, please. Documentation of learning. Always set clear guidelines and do your best to ensure that logbooks or portfolios are in continuous use. All learners should use logbooks to keep a record of each lesson, including notes of new vocabulary, idioms, and structures. Under the teacher's guidance, regularly monitor their progress. Use portfolios to store group projects and share them with the rest of the class. Archiving is rarely talked about, but I think it's vitally important. In consultation with your learners, devise a system of archiving logbooks and portfolios so that they remain available to you. You may want to undertake action research focused on them, and also to the learners themselves, so that you have this gradually growing collection, which is the sediment of the learning that's been going on individually and collaboratively in your class. And when your learners are used to managing their own learning, introduce learning contracts. Next slide, please. Structuring learning. Make sure that your lessons follow a clear, predictable structure. Again, you can't really expect learners to be able to manage their own learning if they can never be sure what's going to happen when you come through the classroom door. And organize learning in clearly defined cycles: plan, implement, evaluate. At lower secondary, a regular structure gives learners security. In our book, we talk about the way in which Lenny Dum divided classes between teacher time at the beginning, a block of learner time in the middle, and together time at the end. Gradually extend the length of learning cycles. Don't expect your learners from the beginning to be able to support a learning cycle that goes for a whole week, never mind several weeks. To begin with, you need to have simple learning cycles that they can follow through in 1 or 2 lessons. But once they've got the hang of it, you'll find that quickly enough, they can support a cycle of learning that extends over 2 or 3 weeks. Adult migrants typically have a wide range of needs, but our experience was that within a regular lesson structure, very similar to Learner Autonomy's, group work can be configured in such a way as to meet individual needs. For example, one of the things adult migrants need to do is prepare themselves for applying for jobs. And so you may have learners working in groups, researching how to apply for a job, looking at what's out there, but individual learners still with the support of the group, filling in application forms, writing letters of application related to their particular skills. In language for academic purposes, it's a good idea, I think, to decide with your students how learning should be organized each semester. In my experience, several learning cycles will probably be easier to manage than a single semester-long cycle. Next slide, please. Learning materials and activities. Do you use a textbook? Must you use a textbook? Strike a balance between activities that focus on aspects of the target language, vocabulary, pronunciation, you'll be able to think of other things. Beginners need to learn the vocabulary they want to learn in order to be able to talk about themselves and their interests. Adult migrants need the vocabulary that is crucial to them in managing their lives in the wider society. Very often, if an adult learner has children, one of the priorities will be to learn the basic vocabulary for types of illness and symptoms, so that when there's an appointment with the doctor, the adult migrant can manage. Mix those kinds of analytic learning activities with learning activities that are intended to produce spoken and/or written text. Language for academic purposes, instead of using a textbook, give your students the task of finding appropriate materials, printed text, podcasts, videos, etc., on the internet, and devising projects that exploit them in various ways. The first of those 3 little feedback texts from the Czech students showed that kind of procedure in operation. Next slide, please. Finally, self-peer and teacher assessment. Criteria, how we judge whether what we're doing is what we wanted to do, should be part of planning and implementation as well as evaluation. And it's supported by ensuring that logbooks are in continuous use. Whoever your learners are, regularly discuss with them how they think they're progressing towards their goals as individuals and as a class. Make sure that learning cycles are accompanied by regular reflection. What are we doing? How are we doing it? Why are we doing it? With what results? What are we going to do next? At the planning stage of each learning cycle, help your learners to reflect on how they'll know whether they've achieved the aims of the cycle. And as the cycle proceeds, make sure that each group keeps in view its learning goals and its assessment criteria. And help your learners to discriminate between different degrees of success. Next slide, please. If you want more on these kinds of issues, then I suggest you read the book that we published in 2017, myself, Learner Autonomy, and Nina Legenhausen. The first part of that book provides a detailed description of an autonomy classroom in action, Danish mixed ability learners of English at lower secondary level. But that's just one illustration of a dynamic that can be easily translated to other learning contexts, such as adult migrants or university students. The second part of the book presents in detail the findings of a longitudinal research project that explored the learning achievement over 4 years of one of Leonidam's classes and presents 2 individual learner case studies. And the third part of the book presents 2 institutional case studies from Ireland that illustrate the power of autonomous learning to support the social inclusion of adult refugees and the educational inclusion of immigrant children, which is my current primary research focus. And it also has a concluding chapter that offers many suggestions for teacher education for language learner autonomy. Someone made the point earlier in the afternoon that one of the problems facing teachers who want to work with the concept of learner autonomy is that they didn't themselves have that experience either as students or as student teachers. Next slide, please. So you'll be glad to see the conclusion, in which I'll say a little about autonomous language learning online. Next slide. This is where I began. My working definition of language learner autonomy. Language learner autonomy is a teaching learning dynamic. From the beginning, learners plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning in the target language. By exercising agency in the target language, they develop proficiency, but they also become autonomous as users as well as learners of their language, which becomes a fully integrated part of their plurilingual repertoire and identity. And that dynamic is captured in the simple diagram on the right of the screen. Next screen, please. Something's gone wrong here. But let me try to unpick it. What this should have done was made the following point, that it's often said that learner autonomy requires a shift in the role of the teacher. And one of the expressions that's often used is from sage on the stage to guide on the side, implying that instead of standing in front of the class and controlling it, the teacher stands on the side and lets the class get on, guiding when necessary. But that's nonsense, because as what I've said has been intended to explain, at every stage, the teacher leads the development of language learner autonomy by doing the things that that final inserted text box conceals. Next slide, please. It's perfectly clear that language learner autonomy, as I've described it, is no less possible online than face-to-face. And the talks that I heard before I gave this one myself showed that these things were being done. It seems to me that working with an online version of this teaching learning dynamic, the key decisions include how often and for how long will the teacher interact with the whole class, how will you arrange group work, how will group projects be submitted and shared with the rest of the class, by what means will your learners document their learning, within a framework of synchronous dialogic communication, will there be a role for asynchronous communication, how will you provide for self and peer assessment, and how will self and peer assessment be related to teacher and or external assessment. And again, it was very clear from the earlier presentations that I heard that you've been asking yourselves these questions and coming up with interesting answers. The next slide is simply my references, of which there aren't a great many. So that, ladies and gentlemen, finally is that.
Hello, everyone. I have a question, and my question is, how can teachers achieve a balance between guiding students to become autonomous learners so that they can accomplish the goals of the course, but there is also space for them to determine their own goals according to their needs?
Well, I think the answer to that question is that the curriculum has to be presented to learners and discussed with them in ways that enable them to make it their own plan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
To all of the presenters. Tani is asking us about the book. The book, you can buy it, as far as I know, in Amazon. Well, at least I bought it, the one that that professor announced it. So we will try, and I am asking right now all the participants, the panelists and our plenarists, that if you can share with us your presentations, and if you can allow us to post the video on the Independent Learner Association conference, where we are going to share these presentations, this video, if you allow us to. And we also want to invite you to the Learner Independent Conference. Can you share the site? Some of, probably Laura, can you share it on the screen? As you know, this conference was supposed to be today and tomorrow, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't, so we organized this event. So in order to do this, now we are happy to tell you that we are organizing the event next year in June 2021, and we will open a new call for participations in October. So please stay in touch with us, so you can please submit your participations to this event. Right now, Laura is going to share our page. We have a Facebook page where we will announce the open for call for participations if you want to. It will be in Mexico. We are hoping that we can have a hybrid presentation, that we can see us, plus some virtual presentations, so we can work with this. So if you have any questions, we're going to post also on the chat, okay, the link where you can download your certificate of attendance as well. Thank you, Laura. So this is the Independent Learner Conference. This says 2020, it will change to 2021. It will be at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and please stay in touch, and we are going to announce everything. Remember, this is a joint event with the Learner Autonomy Special Interest Group and also with the Jesuit University of Guadalajara. So thank you very much. Giovanna, I don't know if you want to say some other words. I leave you the mic to you.
Oh, thank you. I don't know what happened with Adobe Connect. It was really the challenge of technology, but...
Giovanna, we cannot listen to you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I just wanted to say that thank you for taking over.
I think we cannot listen to you, Giovanna.
Adobe Connect. Okay, I'll write it in the chat.
For some reason, Adelia can't, but the rest of us, yes, we can.
Yes, exactly. We can listen to you, Giovanna. For some reason, the one that cannot listen to you is Adelia.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you for taking over. I don't know what happened in Adobe Connect, and I suddenly had no control at all of the technology. But I think one lesson that we can learn is that in order to deal with a big event on a technology, we need a team of several persons, and at the UNAM, you did it perfectly. So thank you to everybody for your patience, and yeah, see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aide, Amelia, Anja, who is not here, Adelina, Atenas,
Thank you.
and all the Mediateca team. Please, thank you very much for all this.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it.